Presiding Officer, I have also made a number of contributions, maybe quite lengthy contributions, and therefore I would wish to be circumspect in respect of the time I have. But I do want to thank Stuart McMillan and his committee for producing what I do think is an excellent report, and I think there have been a number of really good contributions in this debate, including, if I may say so, specifically Michelle Thompson's that we've just listened to, and my colleague Edward Mountain's, who I think actually gave a model class, an excellent class on what the shortcomings of the current set-up is. But we are considering a matter of huge constitutional significance, and it ought to concern every one of us as parliamentarians, because what we're talking about is the shifting balance of power between Parliament, this Parliament, and the Executive. And I know the Minister has been, at times, a little, I think, too thin-skinned about this, but I think most of us think, on the basis of the evidence of our own experience, that there has been a growing tendency towards framework legislation, bills that set out broad principles but leave ministers to fill in the details through secondary legislation later. I'm going to make some progress because I think I can predict what you're going to say. OK, if you'll be very tight.
Minister?
I'm always kind to Mr Kerr, of course. I think uncharitably describing me as thin-skinned, I wouldn't say I was thin-skinned. I am frustrated, though, because yet again it's being asserted that there's an increase in the number of these bills, but no evidence presented. How many? Give me some numbers.
Stephen Kerr?
Highlighted that perhaps that was one aspect of the report that was missing, the actual number. But I think the evidence of our experience in this session is absolutely clear that there has been an increase. And I think, frankly, that the report highlights this fact in the sense that these framework bills are no longer the exception. They're increasingly the norm. And look, I didn't want to argue with anything that Lorna Slater said about the importance. She's not in her place, but I wouldn't have objected to anything she had to say about the place that framework legislation has. But I think Edward Mountain absolutely summed it up when he talked about the important safeguards that need to be put in place when there is a framework bill. And we've got to be careful it doesn't become our standard approach to legislating, which I think is what we're concerned about. And as parliamentarians, we ought to have that concern. We ought to be jealous about the power of this Parliament as delegated to ministers. We ought to be extremely careful and attentive to the way that ministers use the powers that are granted to them through legislation. And at the end of the day, we're talking about the scrutiny of Parliament on a powerful executive. When we talk about this Parliament being the most powerful devolved Parliament in the world, we're actually talking about the Scottish Government, probably one of the most powerful devolved governments anywhere in the world. And the truth is, I think the bottom line is that our structures for scrutinising secondary legislation are simply not strong enough. I will give way to Michelle Thompson.
Michelle Thompson?
With respect, I'll be very quick. Just to point out my recent trip to Atlanta to the Legislative Assembly, in my meeting with the Minister for Economy there, he pointed out all oil and tax take accrues to their bottom line and they have unlimited warning powers. So in terms of the strongest Parliament in the history of humanity, that's not true.
Stephen Kerr.
Said it's the strongest in the history of humanity. I think I've made it clear it's one of the strongest, most powerful in the world, and I think that stands scrutiny. I just don't think our Parliament's design is adequate. I think the way we do things in respect to secondary legislation has been shown time and time again in this debate by colleagues who have brought vast wealth of experience of time spent in this Parliament. We have to look at the unique aspects of our Parliament and how that is limiting the ability of this Parliament to hold the Executive to account and to properly scrutinise their actions. We cannot get into the game of acquiescence. I did not agree, I'm sorry, but I did not agree that COVID should be seen as an exception. It's in that moment of the most severe test of a parliamentary system that the Parliament has to assert its authority, not give it away. That, to me, is acquiescence, as I said a moment ago. So I share the view, strongly held by many who gave evidence to the committee, that when secondary legislation stems from framework acts, our procedures must be up to the task. And that's why I think it is important, and we seem to all agree on this, that when you know one when you see one, is what I think was the consensus view. And I think Stuart McMillan just about said those words. The reality is, if it is the judgment of the Parliament that this is a framework bill, then the way that it is set up in terms of post-legislative scrutiny, in terms of secondary legislative scrutiny, needs to be different. We need to talk about what we really mean.
Mr Kerr is concluding his remarks.
Super affirmative procedures, pre-laying scrutiny, mechanisms that empower the Parliament and don't allow the government to take advantage of the perceived weakness of the design of the processes in order to impose the will of the executive. Now, these ideas I don't think are very radical. And,
Mr Kerr, you will need to conclude, please.
In respect, and I will conclude now, in respect to members of the government party, I do mean this. One day you will not be the government. And you need to put yourself in the position of yourselves as parliamentarians first, occasionally, so that you can see that the best interest of good governance and the future of our country is best served by modernising